The term affordance was popularized by Don Norman in his 1988 book, The Psychology of Everyday Things, now in its latest edition known as The Design of Everyday Things. You can't have an affordance without both the properties of the object as well as a person using the object. Let's use my mug as an example. For an affordance to exist, you need both the object itself, its inherent properties, as well as the person using the object, so me. So it refers to the relationship that arises between the object's properties and the person using it. So the affordance is not the property of the object itself, it is designed. In most cases, whenever we're referring to the affordance of a mug, it would be this handle that affords the human or person using it the ability to hold it as well as not be burned by the contents of a hot beverage. But there are other affordances included in this mug that often are more overlooked. We have a lip here that flares a little bit out, allowing us to put it into our mouths easily. And we have the emptiness inside that contains the liquids that are meant to go into it. Here I think it's important to distinguish that by design, I mean that someone has deliberately created it. In the case of the mug, it wasn't just simply plucked from nature off of a tree. A human had to create it and think about how they wanted it to look and function, behave. It didn't just occur naturally. An affordance isn't always created just for humans. It can be for other agents, like an animal. So think like a doggy door or a treat dispenser for pets. Or for machines, think like a robot that's picking up on various signifiers and affordances to know what to do and behave during different conditions. For me, I like to think of affordances as clues that we pick up on and that suggest what actions are possible, how you should interact with that object, or maybe indicate a little bit about how it works. Sometimes an affordance needs other things working alongside of it to help communicate what to do and where to do it. Let's take a look at this speaker here. It has a signifier, so a plus and a minus, as well as an affordance, some small indentations that function as buttons. And together, those two things help us make sense of what that interaction is meant to be, as well as the result that might happen if we were to do it. Affordances really have to do with the quality of the clue, and there's a wide spectrum in terms of the quality of an affordance. Simply by having an affordance doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to work out well. So when those clues work really well, it feels intuitive and non-mysterious, and that is a good affordance. When those clues resemble a maddening, frustrating, cryptic puzzle, not intuitive, and that is a bad affordance. You often see afterthoughts added after a design has been implemented, and that is always an indication of a not ideal affordance. Think of how many doors you've passed by in your lifetime where you see a handwritten sign attached to the handle or near the handle that tells you whether you should push or pull or slide it. Always an indication of a non-ideal affordance. There are two parts of an affordance to consider. The first is around discoverability. This is something about the object that nudges you as a user to discover its functionality. Usually this indicator is visual, occasionally tactile, and might sometimes employ or tap into other types of cognition, like auditory or kinesthetic. The other part to an affordance is around understanding. This is something about the interface or the object that provides a hint of its purpose and what it might do. I'm going to use this to demonstrate these two principles. First, around discoverability. You can see here there's a little button. It's curved so that your finger can be placed into it, and also has a little bit of a tactile feature to it that makes you feel like you're meant to press it. So we're going to press it and see what happens. Here we go. Now, in terms of understanding, I'm not sure that that affordance leads us to build a greater understanding about what the purpose of this object. In fact, it's rather hidden. If we do a little bit of more exploration, we'll see that the cap comes off and there's a pen at the bottom part of this object. So the affordance itself doesn't actually help us build a deeper understanding of what the object in its whole is meant to do. There are three kinds of affordances: perceptible, false, and hidden. Perceptible affordances are usually what we're talking about whenever we're talking about affordances. False affordances look like an affordance, but really aren't one. You might argue that they're fake affordances, meaning that it seems like or we perceive that a function exists, but in fact it does not. Some believe that things like crosswalk buttons and elevator close buttons are false affordances. Hidden affordances are where the discoverability of the affordance are quite low, and so that affordance is not obvious in any respect. So let's take a look at a couple of objects around my house, see if there is an affordance, and then see if we can gauge the quality of the affordance itself. Let's start easy with affordances. A handle. You grab it, pull, and lift. This pencil sharpener has an affordance where if you press this, the sharpener goes lower and you can sharpen your pencil, and then when you release, the shavings will not come out. Here's a toaster I have a love-hate relationship with, but you can see it has a number of dials and a lever that helps indicate what you might be able to do with it. These toy bricks have some indentations that indicate possibly there's some way of connecting them together. And so hopefully one would quickly discover that you can connect them in a way like that and begin to link them together. My ancient stove has a number of affordances, but with varying degrees of success to them. The dials, obviously you're meant to twist them, but what direction and what do they control? It's not clear if you turn it right or left. Surprise, you turn it left. And did you know that this dial here actually heats this center section up? It's a griddle, which I discovered accidentally and painfully. Jar lids are also kind of murky in terms of affordances. In many cases, we find lids that actually have very little affordance built into it, but are strong on the signifiers, telling us whether we need to close or open it and in what direction. In other cases, there's no signifier, but there's some indentations or a tactile way of indicating that you might grip it here. And it's only through experience and convention that we begin to understand which way we need to turn it to be able to open and which way we need to turn it to close. An eyedropper tool not only has that twist convention, but then has a visual affordance where you can see that there is a liquid inside, and then a tactile affordance at the top where you can feel that by pressing this and then observing what happens, what it might do. In some cases, the affordance itself is not enough to completely communicate what you're meant to do. So these three brushes, clearly you're meant to brush something, but without convention or experience or even additional materials to communicate its individual purpose, it might be difficult to really understand what kind of brushing you're meant to do with these things. This calculator, I'm not really sure that I'd call it an affordance. It has buttons that appear like jewels, and I'm not sure that we often feel like pressing upon jewels, but I'll give it a pass. But where I really draw the line is with the signifiers. The signifiers here, in this case, the numbers on the calculator, are exceptionally hard to read. So this calculator, I don't know that I would say has that great of an affordance. Likewise, this tab is not one that I would necessarily call an affordance. I don't know that there's anything about the tab itself that indicates that I'm meant to wedge my finger under it and pry upwards so that I might open it. I might only learn about this by watching others or giving it a shot and seeing what happens. This one I think is quite funny because it looks like it has possibly two affordances. The first seems very obvious at first glance, that it's a clip of some sort. But why is there a hook on it? Is it a fancy clothesline clip? Well, when we flip it over, we discover through the signifier that it's actually meant to clip to the side of a pot and act as a spoon rest. Taps are a perennial favorite in terms of affordances because they're so confusing about what they might do. There's nothing here with these taps, which aesthetically look just fine, and I think we can all figure out that they're meant to go like that. But how do you know which one is hot and which one is cold? I'll let you figure that one out. When I was looking around for examples of affordances, I came across this board, and I thought it was an excellent example of where the affordance is broken. Because when we look on the side, there's nothing button-like about this button that says erase. Doorknobs and handles come up quite often in the design of everyday things, and with good reason, because they are often very perplexing. Here's an example of a hidden affordance, where you press it to discover that it actually will open using this mechanism here. An object with a hidden affordance. There's nothing on it that indicates that you can press it, although it is made out of a squishy material. There are a couple of concepts that affordances are closely related to, but are not identical to. These include signifiers, constraints, mappings, feedback, conceptual model of the system, and lastly, form and function. The top of the list, signifiers. Simplifiers simply make it easier or clearer about what the affordance does, whereas a constraint is something that limits the interactions or alternatives or keeps you from performing the wrong thing or action. Mappings help us visualize how a control relates to its function, particularly when there are multiple controls in a single object or interface. Feedback helps communicate the results of an action, whereas a conceptual model helps us make sense of all those parts coming together, helps us predict and know how it might work. Lastly, there is some correlation between affordances and form and function. Much like those beautiful, award-winning objects whose form comes at expense of function, there are likewise many objects whose function remain a mystery because the form itself is lacking affordances or does a really poor job at it. So why do we even care about affordances in the digital world? Well, our first designed objects were physical and mechanical, so our understanding of interaction should really begin there. So when you find yourself designing digital interaction, it can really help to understand the affordances found in the physical world. Many digital affordances, in fact, rely upon our past experience and interaction with those very physical objects. And so how intuitive something is digitally is relying on relevant past experience we've had with similar objects found in the physical world. That's why you will often see digital affordances making use of those metaphors that we find in the world around us. So in conclusion, affordances can be found everywhere. And you can learn a lot as a designer simply by observing what works and doesn't work as well, both in the physical and digital worlds. And from this, you can extract your own set of principles or guidelines whenever you find yourself designing an interaction. So affordances, in essence, are just another tool to have in your UX toolkit.